So in this video, I want to talk about the business cycle and give you a case study of potentially two countries and how to really just identify where they are in their business cycle, right? But before we get into that, what I want to go over is just the business cycle again, and another way of of analyzing the business cycle. Now, obviously in the previous videos, I have, for explanation purposes, I've gone through the economic cycle. So you've gone through the expansion, the boom, the contraction, the recession, bust, slump, recovery, expansion, boom, etc., etc., right? And it goes on like this. Now, first of all, matter of fact, economic cycles, right, can take years to play out, right? Where this is time, right? This whole cycle could last, 20, 30, 40 years, right? And within that, each phase of the business cycle could be, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, right? So this whole cycle could be, like I said, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Each cycle is different, right? And obviously each phase of the cycle can last for a considerable amount of time. Now, also what I want to explain is that, let's say, for example, a country has come out of the the bust slump phase and is into a recovery. Jobs are starting to come back into the economy, manufacturing is on the rise, etc., etc., right? So just because technically you're going to see some GDP growth above zero growth, obviously two negative readings below zero growth is what is considered a technical recession. In a recovery, you might get 0.1% growth, right? 0.2, etc., right? But just because we're out of a recession doesn't mean that we couldn't go back into a recession, if you know what I mean. So recoveries can be very, very, very fragile. Yeah. So again, doesn't mean that we're going into the expansion phase because we're now into a recovery phase. Governments and central banks really have to manage the recovery phase of an economy to make sure that it is a recovery, basically, right? Because there are other things that are going on in the world, things like war, politics, and things like that. So and risk sentiment, right, that can really kind of damage the recovery of any country, right? If a government, if an opposing government gets in and their policies are potentially detrimental to the country's growth, right, then pretty much we're going back into not necessarily even the bust slump phase directly, but we would go back into a recession, obviously negative GDP growth, and then this cycle potentially could continue. Or what you could have is we could obviously dip into the recession, but then go back into a recovery. So again, just for explanation purposes, this is what the cycle looks like, but this cycle doesn't always play out. This cycle is almost like a guide, right? It's like a rule of thumb, but there are, situations where you will have, countries and economies that will go from a recovery phase into the back into maybe a recession phase, back into recovery phase, and then expansion, potentially then recovery. So you can have the same thing going back and forth, etc., if you know what I mean. Again, how do you know whether you're in the recovery phase, whether you're in an expansion phase, or whether you are in a contraction phase, right, of the cycle? And not to complicate things too much, but one of the major ways that, and again we've covered it in a previous video, is to really understand the interest rate hiking cycle. So that interest rate cuts are normally associated with, a slowdown in the economy, right? Usually contraction phase, recession phase. And why is that? Because interest rate cuts, allow cheap borrowing, and cheap borrowing for businesses, for consumers to try and stimulate the economy, etc. Right? You don't want to necessarily make things expensive for consumers and businesses in a in a recession or bust phase. So again, as a rule of thumb, this is obviously the hold, and this is the hike, right? And when you're in the the hiking phase, it's usually because inflation, due to you getting out of the because of the interest rate cuts, right, have taken effect, boosting the economy, right? In the recovery phase, you'll see inflation start to come into the the equation, into the economy, and then typically hikes are associated with the recovery and the expansion phase, and potentially like obviously the boom phase, right? So again, it's a rule of thumb, and this is what really central banks will use as their tools for raising or hiking interest rates. So one of the things you need to do is look at a central bank's statement, right? So you can go to indicators, go to countries, and we'll go to the United Kingdom. Now, matter of fact, one of the things I want to say as well is within any of these cycles, within any of these phases in the cycle, let's say, for example, go back to the recovery phase, what can happen is you have, whereas you have this cycle, right, overall, you can have cycles within the recovery phase, right? So recoveries can be very fragile, right? And you can kind of maybe dip back into, if this was, for example, 0%, you can kind of dip back into, negative, GDP, right? So just because you dip back into GDP in the negative GDP in the short term doesn't mean that we're heading into, well, it could mean potentially we're heading back into a recession, right? But we need to confirm it. But we're still in that recovery phase until, technically confirmed. So you can have recoveries, right, that can last for a while, and they do go through, certain cycles within the recovery phase. The same thing with the expansion phase, right? You can have ups and downs within an expansion phase, within a boom phase, etc. It's not always just GDP is up and up and up and up and up, right? So keeping that in mind, if we go back to the UK, right, economy, and we look at GDP growth rate, right? So GDP growth rate in the over the past few years, we've had this cycle. So we've had 0.6, 0.4, 0.7, 0.3, 0.2, up and down kind of thing, right? But if we kind of expand out, we can see that in 2009, 2008, 2009 was the economic crash, the global financial crash of 2008, 2009, right? Then 2010, this being the zero line here, we managed to obviously pull ourselves out of a recession, right, and into the recovery phase, right? So between 2000 and probably 10, right, the United Kingdom has been in a recovery phase, right? Because we've come from the recession, the bust, slump phase, now into a recovery phase, right? And we could have entered into kind of that expansion phase potentially, right, at some period, but obviously we'd need more data. But recovery, right, because we've really gone, sideways within this, 1% and 0%, especially over the past, 4-5 years, right? So for me, looking at this, we are in the recovery phase, right? Also, to add to that, if you're looking at the interest rate hikes, because we need to obviously just, there are hikes and cuts are obviously typically associated with where we are in the business cycle, right? So the Bank of England, right, and it's advised that you do start to read interest rate and central bank statements, right? So the Bank of England left its key bank rate on 0.5%, right, in line with market expectations. However, 3 out of 9 policymakers, including BOE chief economist, voted for a rate hike compared to only 2 votes in the previous meeting. So a rate hike being hawkish, right? These are some smart people, these policymakers, very, very smart. They have access to, so much data, right? And if they go from 2 to 3 policymakers indicating an interest rate hike, obviously they're expecting, they wouldn't be hiking in into a recession, right? They'd be hiking, or the change in sentiment to hike would really be valid and basically considered when they feel, or these members feel, that we are entering potentially into the expansion phase, or we are in an expansion phase of the market, right? So again, read the central banks, because these are the smart people. Central bank policies, these are the smart people. These are the guys that are looking at the economy, and they're the guys that are saying, okay, is it worth holding? Is it worth hiking, right? If they're holding, hiking, that should tell you, right, that we are in potentially a recovery phase. A contraction phase would be, holding and thinking about reducing, interest rates, or cutting interest rates, right? Because they need to cut interest rates to stimulate inflation, to prevent prices going into a recession, right? So if you start seeing central banks worried about, or being more dovish with their central bank policy, right, and they're talking about cutting interest rates, then, or having to reduce interest rates, right, potentially to intervene, using that type of language, then they're doing that because they're in this side of the they feel that they're in this side of the phase, right, the contraction phase. If they're talking about raising interest rates, right, and hiking interest rates, they should be in the the recovery phase, right, of the business cycle. So let's look at something like the Japanese yen. So with the Japanese yen, we can see that their GDP growth rate is 0.2%, right? They've slipped back into negative growth. So that being the case, right? You pretty much know that they're not looking to hike interest rates at any point, right? So what you need is the Japanese yen is in the recovery phase. It looks slightly different from the UK, right, where you have more times that they're in negative, GDP growth. You can see it once, twice, 3 times, extended period here, 4, 5, whereas the UK had it maybe once or twice, right? So the recovery for the Japan economy is more fragile than it is for the UK. The UK central bank, policymakers are obviously expecting more of an expansion in their economy, right, or more of a recovery in their economy in the cycle and where they are, and the fact that they're actually looking to hike rates, right, will give you a massive clue, right? Whereas Japan, right, so it shrink for the first time in 9 quarters, and if we go to We look at, for example, the inflation rate. Now, the inflation rate, is quite steady, 0.7. We know that they really need a target of 2%. Central bank targets are really 2%, right? So you're still a ways off, right, when it comes to inflation, right? And obviously interest rates. The last time they cut their interest rates, right? And you'll read in the central bank statements whether they are looking to hike, hold, or cut, or even introduce things like quantitative easing, or reduce their quantitative easing, right? That can be also a sign that potentially the economy is coming around and inflation is entering into the market, right? But central bank statements will tell you, right, where we are, and give you a massive clue as to where we are in the business cycle, right? And where we're potentially going or potentially heading, right? So hopefully, that is clear. If you do have two central bank policies that are, looking to hike as well, right, or looking to raise interest rates, then what do you expect the market to do, right? Remember, your strength against strength is going to produce sideways ranging markets, right? Because it's more of an even fight. Same as weakness versus weakness, right? If you have strength versus weakness, you're looking at trending markets, right? And sometimes you will have two economies that are in the recovery phase, but one is at the lower end, is really kind of fragile when it comes to the recovery, like the Japanese yen, right? Quite fragile, dipping back into negative growth. And then you'll have another country like the UK, which is also in the recovery phase, but they're talking about potentially holding or hiking interest rates. So with that knowledge, what is it that you would probably want to do for a currency pair like the pound yen? The pound yen, you'd probably want to look to buy. Obviously, we have to do our risk assessment as well, risk on, risk off environment, as the Japanese yen benefits as the safe haven currency, right? So just because price is going down on the pound yen and the yen is strengthening, doesn't necessarily mean that the interest rate hike cycle is not in place, just not in focus at the moment. But once risk is back on again, right, and the fundamentals are still in play, then the pound is still the currency that you want to look to buy. Obviously, keep your finger on the pulse when it comes to economic updates and news events, things like jobs, again, manufacturing, retail sales. Those are obviously what make up the overall economy. And if you start to see a slowdown, an uptick in things like unemployment, and things like that, then obviously we could be seeing a reversal in the recovery, right? So hopefully that all made sense and it's a bit clearer, right? I would suggest that you potentially write out where you think do a case file or evidence, right, that shows you and indicates to you where you think you are in the in the economy, right, as far as the business cycle. Email me at info@trading180.com, right, and I will have a quick look for you. And again, it's not financial advice. I'm not offering any kind of financial advice, but I will, give you my opinion on where I think we are in the economic cycle. So hopefully that helps. Take care, and until the next video.